Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. The history here isn't filled with trumpets or parades, but with footsteps, creaking wheels, and voices carried away by the wind. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these forgotten fragments can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. Now, let's settle into the beginning of our story. The story of the American West did not begin with the sight of saloons, gunfights, or the cattle trails that later defined it in popular memory. It began far earlier, on roads that seemed endless, stretching across landscapes that could swallow a traveler whole. To understand what life in the Wild West was really like, one must first imagine those long roads, the arteries that carried families, loners, traders, and dreamers from the familiar world of the East into the vast, uncertain territories of the West. The journey itself was often longer than the destination. Travelers set out from cities like St. Louis or Independence, Missouri, gathering supplies in towns that buzzed with anxious anticipation. Wooden wagons stood in neat lines, wheels creaking as oxen shifted restlessly in their yokes. The roads they faced were not paved, nor even properly cut. They were paths worn down by the feet of thousands before them, beaten into mud during rains, hardened into stone-like ridges in summer, and lost entirely in winter snow. Those who stepped onto them often knew they might never see their old homes again. Every mile was measured not only in distance, but in endurance. The road westward was both literal and symbolic, a march away from certainty and into hardship. Families packed flour, cornmeal, dried meat, and water casks into wagons already strained by their weight. Tools hung from the sides, axes for chopping wood, shovels for digging out wheels stuck in clay, rifles for protection. Space was precious, and choices were cruel. A cherished family heirloom might be discarded halfway across the prairie when the oxen grew too tired to drag the burden further. The long road demanded sacrifice, and it took more from people than they could ever prepare to give. The air along these roads was rarely still. Dust rose in plumes so thick it coated clothes, hair, and skin. It filled nostrils, lodged in throats, and turned every sip of water into a relief. By night, travelers slept under canvas sheets or beneath their wagons, listening to the wind whistle across the plains. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carrying through the silence like mournful songs. The journey was monotonous yet dangerous, dull yet punctuated with sudden storms or the collapse of a wagon wheel that could stall an entire group for days. These roads also carried contradictions. For some, they represented freedom, the chance to build a new life where no landlord or factory boss dictated terms. For others, they carried despair, as every step forward revealed only more land to cross, more emptiness to endure. The long road was a test of patience. Days bled into each other, and the horizon always seemed to retreat just as one approached it. Not all travelers were settlers. Many were traders, hauling goods to frontier towns, hoping to profit from the thirst for cloth, tools, or liquor where supplies were scarce. Others were soldiers sent to guard forts, their boots wearing thin against the same punishing earth. Some were prospectors chasing rumors of gold, their wagons lighter, their pace quicker, their eyes set, not on homesteads, but on sudden wealth. Each found themselves on the same roads, bound together by geography even if their reasons for traveling were wildly different. Water was the lifeblood of the journey, and it was never guaranteed. Streams could vanish in drought, and rivers could swell into unpassable floods. A single bad decision in choosing where to camp could mean thirst or sickness. Cholera haunted the trails, spreading through shared water barrels, striking swiftly and cruelly. Graves lined the paths westward, marked with simple wooden crosses, often already leaning before the family had travelled far beyond them. Travellers spoke of the roads not only as a means of passage, but as graveyards stretching hundreds of miles. The roads were not empty of people before settlers arrived. Native tribes had known and walked these landscapes for centuries. The paths often followed trails that buffalo once carved into the earth, or routes long used for hunting and trade. To the newcomers, the land seemed untouched, but it was not. It was lived in, named, and remembered by those who already understood its rhythms. The meeting of these two worlds along the long roads, one moving westward with wagons, the other already rooted in the land, would shape much of the struggle and conflict that defined the West. Animals bore much of the suffering. Oxen trudged slowly, their ribs often visible by the end of the journey. Horses stumbled over rocky ground, and mules brayed in exhaustion. A broken animal could mean the difference between progress and despair. Many a wagon was abandoned on the trail, its boards left to rot in the sun, its owner forced to march the rest of the way on foot. The landscape became littered with the skeletons of wagons and beasts, mute testimony to the cruelty of the journey. Despite these hardships, there were moments of stillness when the land revealed its quiet beauty. At dawn, the sky stretched wide, painted in soft pinks and golds. The endless prairies glistened with dew. Herds of bison sometimes appeared on the horizon, moving like dark clouds across the grasslands. Birds wheeled overhead, their calls echoing in the vastness. These sights gave travelers both comfort and a reminder of how small they were in the face of the wilderness. Life along the road required a kind of discipline that soon became second nature. Wagons rolled at dawn, rested at midday, and halted before dark. Camps were set with practiced movements. Fires lit, food boiled, animals watered, children settled. Songs were sung quietly, sometimes as prayers, sometimes simply to cut through the monotony. The road west was not only a physical passage, but also a classroom, teaching patience, teaching resilience, teaching the art of enduring without certainty of reward. There was little glamour here, nothing of the romanticized West of later stories. No duels in the streets, no dramatic showdowns, no easy victories, just slow progress, measured in aching feet and weary animals. The people who walked or rode these roads often did not think of themselves as pioneers or heroes. They thought only of survival, of reaching the next river, of keeping their children fed, of ensuring that one more sunrise found them alive and moving forward. The longer one traveled west, the more the world of the east seemed to fade. Familiar accents mixed with new ones. The chatter of towns was replaced by the creak of wagons and the rustle of wind in the grass. The sound of church bells or factory whistles gave way to silence, broken only by insects and the distant roll of thunder. The roads were more than routes. They were a slow transformation, stripping away the comforts of one world and preparing those who walked them for another. Some who began the journey never completed it. Illness, exhaustion, or despair sent them back east, retracing steps they had thought final. But most pressed forward, because turning back meant facing the shame of defeat, the loss of savings, the end of dreams. The roads demanded stubbornness, and stubbornness often outweighed fear. What strikes one most about these long roads is not a single dramatic moment, but their unrelenting sameness. The monotony itself became the trial. Each mile looked like the last, and the human mind struggled to hold hope against the vast, repetitive landscape. It was not gunfire or battles that defined the West for most travelers. It was the steady trudge of feet and hooves, the endless rattle of wagon wheels, the unchanging horizon that refused to yield. And yet, step by step, wagon by wagon, the travelers moved forward. Towns rose where roads met rivers. Way stations appeared where weary souls needed rest. And eventually, these roads became the skeleton of the West itself. Before the Wild West could be lived, before its towns could be built, before its legends could be born, there were only the long roads, dusty, harsh, and unrelenting. that carried ordinary people into the unknown. The road west was nothing without the wagons that filled it, those wooden frames on wheels that became homes, shelters, and prisons for the people who rode within them. To picture life in the Wild West, one must imagine the slow procession of these creaking contraptions, rolling endlessly forward, their shadows stretching across the dry earth. They were not grand carriages, but plain, sturdy boxes built of pine or oak, reinforced with iron rims that groaned under the weight of everything a family owned. Each wagon was a moving world, packed with the fragments of a life left behind and the fragile hope of a new one ahead. Inside, sacks of flour pressed against barrels of water, iron pots clanged with every rut in the road, and blankets lay folded in corners waiting for the night. The space was so limited that every object had to earn its place. A child's toy might be cast aside when an axle snapped, a chest of books abandoned on the roadside when oxen weakened, a cradle burned for firewood on a cold morning. The wagon taught its passengers a harsh lesson. Dreams had to fit within a wooden frame, and sentiment often weighed more than wood could bear. The animals that pulled them were as important as the wheels themselves. Oxen, slow but enduring, were the beasts of choice for many. Horses, admired for their speed, often faltered under the burden of endless days. Mules, stubborn yet resilient, were valued by those who could tolerate their tempers. Every hoofbeat struck against the earth like a clock, measuring time not in hours, but in miles. The animals determined the pace of life, and when they stumbled, all of life stumbled with them. Dust was the constant companion of the wagon road. It rose in thick clouds from every wheel, drifting into eyes, coating food, and settling into hair until travelers wore it like another layer of skin. It stung throats and dried lips, making each sip of water precious. Children coughed against it. Mothers wrapped cloths over their mouths, and fathers trudged forward with their hats pulled low, knowing there was no escape. Dust followed even in sleep, carried on the wind, settling over blankets as though to remind all that the land would not let them pass easily. And always the horizon waited. It stretched unbroken, an endless line where the sky bent down to kiss the earth, never closer, no matter how far the wagons rolled. It was a view both beautiful and cruel. The sheer vastness of it filled hearts with awe, but it also wore down the spirit. Day after day, travelers saw the same sight: grass swaying in the wind, sky arching overhead, and that stubborn line ahead that refused to yield. The monotony was a trial greater than storms. It tested the mind's endurance as much as the body's. Within the wagons, life went on in miniature. Babies cried, soothed by mothers who balanced them against the rocking of the wheels. Meals were cooked hastily over small fires at rest stops, the smell of boiling beans or cornmeal mixing with the smoke of damp wood. Men walked beside the wagons, hands resting on rifles or whips, their eyes scanning the land for obstacles or threats. Children played with sticks or stones, inventing games to fill the long hours, their laughter carried away on the wind. These sounds, creaking wheels, coughing dust, tired voices, became the music of the road. The wagons did not travel alone. They gathered in long trains, dozens strung together like beads, for safety and companionship. At night, they circled into rough forts, the animals tied in the center, the fires burning low. Around them, the prairie stretched silent and immense, broken only by the stars above. The stars themselves became companions, maps for direction, reminders that the sky was constant even when the land felt endless. Travelers spoke quietly by the fire, voices muffled as if afraid to disturb the vastness around them. For many, the wagon was both burden and sanctuary. Its wooden walls shielded against storms and sun, yet its confines pressed close upon the body. Space was too narrow to stand, too crowded to lie in comfort. Families jostled against barrels and tools, sleeping in corners, waking stiff and sore. Yet when wolves howled in the distance or rain swept across the plain, the wagon became a fortress, however fragile. The creak of its timbers was a reassurance that something still stood between fragile humans and the vastness of the wilderness. Accidents were inevitable, Wheels splintered on rocks, axles cracked in river crossings, canvas covers tore in the wind. A broken wheel could mean hours of repair, sometimes days. Spare parts were precious, often crafted on the spot with whatever wood could be found. When no repair was possible, wagons were left behind, silent markers of failure, their boards bleaching under the sun. Travelers passed them with quiet glances, understanding that each abandoned frame was not just wood, but the story of a family forced to surrender. Illness spread easily in the cramped space. Dust irritated lungs, tainted water carried disease, and exhaustion weakened resistance. Cholera was the most feared. It struck quickly, draining life in hours, leaving families to bury loved ones in shallow graves by the roadside. Wooden crosses dotted the landscape, so many that the roads themselves became lined with sorrow. Yet still the wagons moved on, for there was no choice but forward. There were moments, though, when the harshness lifted. A sudden rain would settle the dust, leaving the air fresh and cool. A stream discovered at dusk would bring laughter as faces and hands were washed clean. On some nights, when the sky turned crimson at sunset, the wagons seemed almost noble, their silhouettes glowing in the fading light. These moments reminded travelers why they endured, even if only for a brief glimpse of beauty before the road resumed its demands. Children often remembered the wagons not with bitterness, but with wonder. To them, the canvas roof was a tent, the swaying ride an adventure. They carved initials into the boards, sang songs as the wheels rolled, and dreamed of the land ahead with a hope that adults sometimes lacked. Their resilience gave strength to parents who might otherwise have faltered. In their eyes, the endless horizon was not a threat, but a promise. The wagons also carried stories. At campfires, travelers shared tales of where they had come from. Farmhouses in Ohio, tenements in New York, villages in Germany or Ireland. Languages mingled, accents mixed, and the road west became a corridor of cultures. These stories filled the long hours, weaving together strangers into companions. For many, the friendships formed along the wagon road lasted longer than the journey itself. Every creak of the wheels brought people deeper into the unknown. They crossed rivers that seemed impossible, climbed hills where wagons tilted dangerously, and entered stretches of land so empty it felt as though the earth itself had been abandoned. And still, the dust clung to them, and still, the horizon refused to yield. The wagon road was not a grand adventure, but a slow surrender, a giving of body and spirit to the demands of distance. And yet, without the wagons, there would have been no west. They carried not just people, but the seeds of towns, the tools of farms, the fabric of lives yet to be built. Within their wooden frames rattled the future, nails for building, seeds for planting, books for teaching, and the fragile will of those who dreamed of something better. The wagons were not merely vehicles, they were the first fragile foundations of what the Wild West would become. By the time the wheels wore down and the dust settled, those who had endured the journey were no longer the same as when they began. The horizon had shaped them, the dust had marked them, and the endless creak of wagon timbers had taught them patience. The road west was long, but the wagons carried more than cargo. They carried transformation. The wagons did not roll forever. At some point, the horizon that had stretched endlessly began to yield to a different kind of labor. Families grew weary of moving, traders sought permanent stalls, and settlers realized that dreams could not be lived entirely on the road. The long trails gave way to small clusters of buildings, and the Wild West began to take shape in the form of towns. Fragile, hurried creations built from whatever hands and land could offer. At first, a town was no more than a stopping place. A blacksmith might set up a forge where wagons often broke down, hammering iron against the anvil until the sound became a beacon for travelers. A merchant would pitch a tent nearby, offering flour, tools, or tobacco at inflated prices. Soon, other wagons would linger, and shelters of canvas and wood would rise. From such simple beginnings, towns were born, not from design, but from necessity. The timber that framed these towns often came from the land itself. Trees were felled in great numbers, their trunks split into planks, their bark stripped for kindling. Log cabins rose quickly, square structures with roofs of sod or shingles, smoke drifting from makeshift chimneys. Streets were not planned so much as trampled into existence, paths carved by the boots of settlers and the hooves of animals. Mud clung to them in spring, dust swallowed them in summer, and by winter they froze hard beneath wagon wheels. Yet in these crude layouts, something resembling community began to emerge. Hope was the true mortar of these towns. Each board nailed in place carried a silent promise that life could be steadier here than on the endless trail. Settlers built not just homes, but gathering places. Saloons were among the first to appear, their swinging doors welcoming the weary with whiskey and rough company. Churches followed, raised by hands eager for a reminder of stability, their bells sometimes no more than iron pans struck with a mallet. Schools were built from single rooms, their walls thin, their benches rough, but their presence a sign that children deserved more than dust and horizon. Life in these towns was precarious. Fires could sweep through in minutes, carried by dry winds, leaving nothing but ash where weeks of labor had stood. Disease spread quickly in close quarters, especially when clean water was scarce. Supplies ran low in harsh seasons, forcing families to ration grain or barter possessions for food. The line between survival and collapse was always thin, yet the towns endured because those who built them had already endured so much on the road. The sounds of building were constant in those early days. The sharp ring of hammers, the groan of saws, the thud of logs dropped into place. Voices rose in argument and laughter, neighbors calling for help to raise a roof or dig a well. The air smelled of fresh-cut timber, smoke from cooking fires, and the sweat of bodies working from dawn to dusk. At night, lanterns glowed faintly through cracks in cabin walls, scattering little pockets of light into the darkness. Trade soon became the heartbeat of these settlements. Merchants stocked shelves with goods brought by wagon, or later by rail. Prices were steep, and choices few, but the presence of a store meant a community had taken root. Farmers brought in corn, beans, and potatoes to barter. Hunters sold pelts. Blacksmiths repaired tools or fashioned new ones from scrap. The flow of goods was uneven, yet each exchange tied people closer together, binding lives by necessity as much as by friendship. In such towns, time seemed to stretch and contract at once. Days were long with labor, but years passed quickly as cabins turned into rows of buildings, and tents gave way to wooden storefronts. What had begun as a way station grew into a destination, a place marked on maps, a name whispered by travelers as a point of rest. Every new house was a declaration that the wilderness could be tamed, if only in small pieces. The challenges, however, were relentless. Timber cracked in the dry heat, and roofs leaked under sudden rains. Streets turned into rivers of mud in spring, swallowing boots to the ankle. Chickens roamed freely, pigs rooted in the dirt, and dogs barked at the arrival of strangers. The line between order and chaos was narrow. Law was often improvised, a matter of agreement between neighbors or enforced by the strongest voice. Arguments over land or water could escalate quickly, reminding all that community was as fragile as the boards that held it together. Yet the people clung to rituals that gave meaning to their existence. Festivals were held when harvests succeeded, small gatherings with fiddles playing and lanterns strung across streets. Weddings were celebrated with dancing on rough plank floors, children spinning in circles until their laughter drowned out the memory of hardship. Funerals, too, were marked with solemnity, neighbors walking together to lay another body in the earth, the sound of shovels blending with quiet prayers. These moments, whether joyous or sorrowful, wove a fabric of belongings stronger than timber. For children, the towns were worlds of discovery. They ran barefoot through dusty streets, played games with sticks and stones, and chased chickens until scolded back to chores. Schoolhouses, however crude, gave them letters to shape their world, numbers to measure their days, and stories to imagine lives beyond the prairie. Their laughter echoed between buildings, a reminder that the future belonged to those who could see hope even in hardship. As towns grew, their character shifted. Streets widened, saloons multiplied, and signs painted in bold letters offered goods and services. A sense of permanence crept in, even when the buildings themselves leaned under the wind. With permanence came the complexity of society, disputes over property, gossip whispered at wells, alliances formed in churches or saloons. People were no longer just travelers, they were neighbors, bound together by proximity and need. The architecture was plain, yet it carried a rugged charm. False front buildings lined streets, their facades taller than their structures, designed to give the illusion of grandeur. Boardwalks were laid to keep boots out of mud, though they rattled under every step. Windows were small, often covered with shutters against storms. Yet behind each door was a story. Families eating by candlelight, merchants counting coins, weary farmers stretching aching limbs. These buildings, modest as they were, held the essence of human determination. There was always a sense that these towns stood on borrowed time, their timber vulnerable to weather, their hopes fragile against the vastness of the land. Yet it was precisely their impermanence that made them remarkable. Out of emptiness, people had carved places of belonging. They had raised walls against the wind, lit fires against the dark, and declared by their presence that life could exist, where once there had been only horizon. The Wild West was not only gunfights and cattle drives. It was also the slow, patient act of building towns from timber and hope, of turning trails into streets, of exchanging loneliness for community. The settlers who hammered nails into rough boards may not have thought of themselves as shaping history, yet their work laid the foundation for everything that followed. In the quiet rhythm of saws and hammers, in the glow of lanterns across the prairie night, the West was no longer just a dream. It was a place, fragile but real, born from the hands of those who stayed. When timber walls had been raised and streets stamped into the soil, the towns of the West began to breathe with a rhythm of their own. Every community, no matter how small or fragile, seemed to take on two distinct heartbeats, one rattling with laughter, music, and the clatter of glasses, the other hushed with hymns, prayer, and the solemn stillness of faith. These were the saloons and the churches, standing sometimes side by side, their doors opening onto the same dusty streets, but offering very different kinds of refuge. The saloon came first, more often than not. It required little more than a structure with swinging doors, a long counter fashioned from rough boards, and a few barrels of liquor hauled in at great expense. Inside, lamplight flickered against the walls, smoke from cigars and pipes drifted into the rafters, and the air filled with the constant scrape of boots against wooden floors. The piano, when one could be found, became a prized possession, its notes jangling into the night even when half the keys refused to sound. For many, the saloon was more than a place to drink. It was a gathering hall, a message board, a place where loneliness could be dulled by the presence of others. Travelers arrived dusty and weary from the trail, throwing coins onto the bar for a glass of whiskey that burned as much as it comforted. Cowboys slouched in corners, cards in hand, their eyes hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Miners, flush from a lucky strike or empty-handed from weeks of labor, gathered around tables where fortunes shifted with every turn of a card. The noise carried into the street, the rattle of dice, the bark of laughter, the crash of bottles. Arguments flared as quickly as friendships, voices rising over the piano's uneven chords. The saloon was a place where masks slipped, where exhaustion found its release, and where the boundaries of civility stretched thin under the weight of liquor and desire. In its dim light, people sought not only escape but also connection, however fleeting. Behind the bar stood figures as constant as the buildings themselves. Bartenders became confidants, their ears collecting stories of broken hopes, near disasters, and small triumphs. They poured drinks, broke up fights, and listened with an expression that betrayed neither judgment nor surprise. In many ways, They held more knowledge of the town than anyone else, their hands sticky with spilled whiskey, but their minds cataloguing the quiet struggles of every patron. Yet even as the saloons rattled with life, the towns also carried a quieter pulse. On Sundays, or whatever day had been chosen for worship, voices lifted not in laughter, but in hymns. The church, often built from the same rough timber as every other building, stood as a symbol of order and restraint. Its bell, sometimes cast in iron, sometimes improvised from whatever could be found, rang out across the prairie, calling the scattered community to gather. Inside, benches crowded with families, the smell of wood mingling with the faint scent of candle wax. Children squirmed under their parents' steady hands, while tired farmers bowed their heads in reverence. The preacher's voice, sometimes polished, often rough with the strain of work and travel, filled the room with words meant to guide, comfort, or warn. Hymns rose softly, untrained voices joining together until the sound swelled beyond the walls, carried into the wide sky above. The church was more than a place of worship. It was a marker of belonging, a statement that life could hold not only toil, but also meaning. It hosted weddings, binding couples in promises that felt both fragile and eternal. It marked deaths with prayers and silence, offering a kind of dignity against the harshness of the land. It gathered people in times of trouble, when crops failed or storms struck, reminding them that hardship shared was lighter than hardship borne alone. The contrast between saloon and church was stark, yet both were essential. The saloon offered release, the church offered restraint. One rattled deep into the night with clinking glasses and shouted songs, while the other stood quiet in the morning light, its doors opening onto dusty streets still littered with the echoes of laughter and fights. Together, they revealed the contradictions of frontier life, the desire to forget and the need to remember, the pursuit of freedom and the search for guidance. Neither was free from flaws. Saloons often fueled debts, spreading misery as easily as cheer. Men lost wages at card tables, fights spilled into the streets, and broken bottles glistened under the moonlight. Churches, too, sometimes carried division. Their congregations split over doctrine, or their preachers weighed down by hypocrisy. Yet even with these imperfections, both institutions endured, because they answered needs as old as humanity itself, the need for release and the need for meaning. On certain evenings, the two worlds brushed against each other in unexpected ways. A fiddler who played in the saloon on Saturday night might lead hymns in the church on Sunday morning. A gambler who drank deep into the night might still bow his head at the pew, his eyes heavy, but his hands folded. Children who chased each other outside the church doors sometimes wandered past the saloon, peeking in at the noisy grown-up world within. The town was too small for strict separation. Lives overlapped, tangled, and carried the mark of both. The saloon drew in strangers, while the church bound together neighbors. Together they anchored the community, one in noise and the other in silence. The Wild West, often remembered for its guns and cattle, also pulsed with these two rhythms. The rattle of glasses, the shuffle of boots on rough floors, the murmur of prayers, the rise of hymns. These were the sounds that filled the towns, shaping their spirit more than gunfire ever could. Night after night, the saloons glowed with lamplight, their doors swinging endlessly as men drifted in and out, laughter spilling into the darkness. And morning after morning, the church stood still against the horizon, its modest steeple pointing upward, its bell ready to call the weary back to reflection. Between the two, life balanced itself, chaotic, fragile, hopeful, and real. In these simple places, one rattling with clamor and the other hushed with devotion, the West revealed its truest self. It was not only a land of violence and survival, but also a place where people sought comfort, where they built sanctuaries for both the restless body and the searching soul. And in their own way, the saloons and the churches became as iconic to the frontier as the wagons that had carried people there, or the roads that stretched beyond the horizon. As the nights of rattling saloons bled into mornings of quiet churches, the towns themselves pressed against a sharper edge of existence. For every hymn sung, and every glass raised, there remained the unsettled question of order, how it was kept, and how easily it might slip away. In the Wild West, laws traveled slower than people, slower than the cattle herds, slower even than the rumors that blew like dust across the plains. And so, into this unsettled space, stepped two kinds of figures, those who claimed to enforce the law, and those who lived by breaking it. Between them lay a line so thin, it often blurred in the heat of the day and the haze of whiskey-soaked nights. The lawman was not always a man of iron principles. Sometimes he was, but just as often he was a former drifter, a gambler, or even a reformed outlaw himself. Towns desperate for order appointed sheriffs, not through careful selection, but through necessity, offering a badge to anyone with a steady hand and enough boldness to wear it. The badge did not make a man just, nor did it make him strong. It was a symbol, fragile and easily tarnished, yet one that townsfolk clung to in their hope for safety. The outlaw, in turn, was not always the snarling villain of stories told by firelight. He could be charming, clever, even admired. Some turned to banditry because they had nothing left, driven by hunger or debt. Others carried a taste for risk, the open road, and the defiance of rules they believed were written for others. Their names drifted across counties like shadows, whispered by travelers and carved into wanted posters that fluttered on dusty walls. The tension between lawmen and outlaws shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. A quiet knock on a saloon door might mean a poker game interrupted by an arrest. A distant gunshot might mark the beginning or end of a chase that stretched across miles of open land. The townspeople lived between these forces, wary of both. For every sheriff who kept the peace, there was another who drank too deeply, gambled too freely, or took bribes in exchange for looking the other way. For every outlaw who terrorized, there was another who, in his own way, became a folk hero, seen as a man who fought against the same hardships everyone else endured. Shootouts, the kind that echo through legend, were not as common as stories would have them, yet the fear of them lingered in every gathering. A hand resting too long near a holster, a glance held a second too long, a card flipped with too much force. These small gestures carried weight in towns where tempers flared as easily as gunpowder. When bullets did fly, they shattered more than silence. They carved grief into families, sent ripples of fear across streets, and left behind stains that even the dry winds could not fully erase. But beyond the sudden violence, the contest between law and lawlessness often played out in quieter ways. In the dim glow of an oil lamp, a sheriff might write reports that few would ever read, his words a record of order that felt more like hope than reality. At the same time, an outlaw might sit by a campfire on the open plain, counting stolen coins and wondering how long before another posse took to the trail. Both men carried the weight of choice, bound by circumstance and opportunity, aware that fortune could turn against them with every passing day. The communities themselves became the stage where this thin line blurred. In 1 week, the sheriff might stand in the church pews, his hat in his hands, his voice joining in a hymn. In the same week, he might find himself sharing a drink in the saloon with men he was meant to keep in line, trading laughter while knowing that the night could sour in an instant. Outlaws, too, were not always strangers. Sometimes they were familiar faces, neighbors who had vanished one season and returned the next with new names, old debts, and a pistol worn smooth from use. Trust became a fragile currency. Families wanted protection, yet they also knew that the man wearing the badge might falter, might fail, or might take advantage of the authority he carried. Travelers wanted safe passage, yet they also carried stories of stagecoaches robbed, trains halted, and cattle herds stolen in the dead of night. For every town that prided itself on order, there was another where fear lingered in every shadow, where the sheriff's badge was little more than a decoration, and where the outlaw's word carried more weight than any written law. The most haunting truth of the frontier was that lawmen and outlaws were not opposites, but reflections. Both were shaped by the same rough land, driven by the same hunger for survival, the same thirst for recognition. and the same awareness that life in the West could be cut short without warning. A man who enforced the law one year could just as easily abandon it the next. His hand turned to theft when wages dried up or promises went unpaid. An outlaw, cornered and weary, might accept a badge if offered, his past washed away by the town's desperate need for order. In the dusty air of the West, morality was not written in stone. It was etched into shifting sands, carried by winds, bent by hunger, greed, fear, and hope. Those who carried guns lived with the knowledge that their choices would echo beyond themselves, into the families who waited, into the towns who whispered, and into the stories that would outlast them. By night, when saloons rattled and churches stood silent, both lawman and outlaw moved through the same streets. One walked with a badge pinned to his chest, the other with shadows clinging to his name. Yet both felt the same crunch of boots on dust, the same weight of eyes watching from windows, the same awareness that the line between them was drawn not by fate, but by choices made in the moment. And so the Wild West pulsed with this tension, not of clear heroes and villains, but of blurred faces, fragile loyalties, and lives balanced on the edge of survival. The rattling saloons might have carried laughter, and the quiet churches might have carried prayer, but it was the uneasy presence of lawmen and outlaws, so alike, so opposed, that gave the land its sharpest edge, its most enduring legend, and its most fragile truth. For all the noise of gunfire and the whispers of law and outlaw, life in the West was not lived only in saloons or on dusty streets. It was carried out in quieter places, inside homes made of timber, sod, or stone, where survival was measured not by badges or bullets, but by the daily act of enduring. A house on the frontier was never just a shelter. It was a fragile defense against wind that howled across plains, against winters that pressed sharp as knives, and against the loneliness that settled in when the land stretched too far in every direction. Many homes rose not from abundance, but from scarcity. Timber was precious, hauled from distant forests or scavenged from riverbanks. Sod houses, built from blocks of earth stacked into crude walls, offered warmth in winter but leaked during storms, their ceilings dripping mud as families huddled close together. Log cabins, rough-hewn and uneven, carried the scent of smoke from their chimneys, smoke that stained ceilings dark and clung to clothes until it became part of the air itself. Within these walls, life unfolded not as the grand dramas told in legends, but in the ordinary rhythm of work, hunger, and hope. Every home bore the marks of its maker's hands. Rough-hewn beams carried the uneven strike of axes, doors sagged on makeshift hinges, and windows, when they existed at all, were patched with oiled paper or scraps of cloth instead of glass. The floor was often packed earth, swept clean with branches tied into crude brooms. The hearth or stove at the center of the room was more than a place to cook. It was the fragile heart of survival, the source of heat that kept families alive through nights when the cold pressed too deeply against the walls. Inside these dwellings, space was tight. Privacy was a luxury rarely known. Parents, children, and sometimes hired hands or extended kin slept together in one or two small rooms. Straw mattresses creaked under weight, quilts were patched from worn-out clothing, and the night air seeped through cracks no matter how many times they were stuffed with rags. Yet for all their discomfort, these homes carried the weight of dreams. The dream that roots could be planted, that families could endure, that the land itself could be coaxed into yielding more than hardship. Life within the walls was unrelenting labor. From dawn until night, every member of a household carried tasks. Women tended fires, cooked meals of beans, cornmeal, or whatever scraps could be gathered, and kept children clothed in garments patched again and again. Men labored in fields, mended fences, or cut wood to feed the insatiable stove. Children, from the moment they were old enough to walk, fetched water, gathered kindling, or cared for younger siblings. Survival on the frontier allowed no idleness. Every hand was needed, every hour of daylight pressed into use. The struggle was not only with work, but with isolation. Neighbors might live miles apart, their homes dots scattered across a vast canvas of land. Visits were rare. reserved for Sundays, harvest gatherings, or emergencies. Letters from relatives back east arrived months late, their ink faded by distance and time. News traveled slowly, carried by riders or newspapers that passed from one home to another until their pages frayed. In this emptiness, silence became its own presence, comforting at times, but just as often heavy, pressing against the walls until the crackle of fire or the cry of a coyote felt like reminders that the world had not entirely gone still. Nature itself was both companion and adversary. Summers brought swarms of insects that buzzed through open cracks, their bites leaving welts on tired skin. Winters came hard, with snow that piled high against doorways and winds that seeped through every gap. Families huddled together under blankets, their breath hanging in the air, listening to the groan of timbers under frost. In the spring, floods could sweep through, undoing months of labor in a single night. And always there was drought, the silent thief that withered crops and left wells dry, its grip turning fields into dust and families into wanderers. Inside these fragile shelters, food was never guaranteed. Meals were plain, measured carefully to stretch through lean seasons. Cornbread, beans, salted pork, and hardtack filled tables when they could be afforded. Gardens provided when the soil allowed, though pests and weather could undo them with ease. Women spent long hours over stoves or open fires, boiling, baking, or preserving, aware that one spoiled jar or burned loaf might carry consequences beyond hunger. In hard winters, meals grew thinner, thin broth stretched with roots, or bread baked from whatever scraps of grain could be spared. Yet, for all its hardships, the frontier home was not only a place of struggle, but also of small comforts that carried weight far greater than their size. A rocking chair carved by hand, a quilt stitched from scraps of memory, a Bible or book carried across miles. These objects became anchors in a shifting world. Stories told by firelight gave shape to evenings. Hymns sung softly carried comfort through storm-laden nights. And the laughter of children, brief as it was between chores, broke through the silence like sunlight through cloud. The presence of danger outside only heightened the fragile sanctuary within. Wolves howled at night, and the threat of raids or strangers at the door never fully disappeared. Families slept with rifles propped nearby, their comfort not in safety, but in the readiness to defend. A knock after dark could send hearts racing, for visitors on the frontier did not always come with goodwill. And yet, even knowing this, doors opened when they had to, because the code of the land demanded hospitality as much as it demanded caution. In the rhythm of these homes, resilience was not heroic, but ordinary. It was found in the woman who rose before dawn to knead bread, in the child who carried buckets of water without complaint, in the man who patched a roof for the third time after a storm tore it loose. Survival was built in increments, in days endured, in seasons passed, in the uncelebrated persistence of ordinary families who made homes in places where comfort was rare. The frontier home stood as a paradox, fragile in its materials, yet enduring in its meaning. Walls of sod could crumble, roofs of wood could rot, and winters could hollow them with cold, but within those walls lay the will to persist. Each home was not only a shelter, but a statement that in the face of endless horizons, of dust, drought, and danger, families chose to remain, to build, to endure. As the days stretched into years, these homes became the backbone of the West. They did not glitter like saloons, nor echo with hymns like churches, nor thunder with gunfire like dusty streets. Yet they carried within them the quiet strength that allowed towns to grow, fields to flourish, and lives to be lived. The Wild West was not only forged in battles or in lawmen's legends, but in the silent endurance of families who bent their backs to the work, who carried on through hunger and cold, who made their homes out of timber, earth, and hope, and who survived. Beneath the endless sky of the frontier, women moved through lives often overlooked in legend, but woven into every thread of survival. Their presence in the West was not confined to the shadow of men, nor was it shaped only by the romantic images of novels and dime store tales. Instead, it was marked by the steady persistence of work, the quiet bearing of burdens, and the uncelebrated strength that kept families, farms, and even towns from unraveling. From the earliest light of dawn, the rhythm of a woman's labor began and rarely paused until nightfall. She was often the first to rise, kindling fires from the embers of yesterday, stirring pots of porridge, and setting bread to bake long before the rest of the household stirred from their beds. Her hands were worn from washboards, her back bent from tending gardens, her mind sharpened by necessity as she stretched what little provisions there were into meals that could last a family through hunger's edge. Where the home itself stood fragile against the elements, it was women who made it endure. Their days were heavy with tasks that stretched beyond the home. In fields, they sowed seeds beside husbands and children, pulled weeds until their fingers split, and harvested grain under the same burning sun that darkened men's brows. In the barn, they milked cows, fed livestock, and churned butter from the morning's yield. They carried water from wells, hauled wood from forests, and patched clothes that had already been patched too many times before. Their labor was not confined to one role, but shifted endlessly, filling whatever space survival demanded. And yet, their influence was not merely in labor. Women carried with them the fragile fabric of community in places where solitude stretched wide. They tended the sick with poultices and whispered prayers, became midwives when children arrived in cabins far from any doctor, and offered comfort to neighbors when death visited, as it often did. Their voices lifted in hymns inside small churches. Their hands organized gatherings where quilts were stitched not only for warmth but for fellowship. In the long silence of the plains, they were often the ones who bound households and neighbors together, stitching ties of humanity into landscapes that might otherwise have felt empty. Beyond the image of wives and mothers, women carved paths into roles rarely acknowledged in their time. Some ran boarding houses that offered beds to weary travelers, their kitchens filled with the scents of stew and bread, their tables the quiet centers of conversation where news and gossip spread. Others opened schools, teaching children in rooms where chalk dust mingled with the smell of oil lamps, passing down not only letters and numbers, but the fragile hope of opportunity. Still others worked as shopkeepers, milliners, or seamstresses, their trades giving towns both shape and endurance. Not all women of the frontier lived within the walls of homes. Some took to the saddle, driving cattle, managing farms alone after husbands fell to illness or violence, or seeking fortune in the same harsh ways as men. Widows, abandoned wives, and unmarried women often bore responsibilities that left no room for the genteel myths spun about them in distant cities. They learned to shoot rifles not as novelty, but as necessity, to mend plows and wagons, to negotiate with traders and lenders. The land offered little mercy, and women who remained upon it found themselves reshaped by its demands. The myths that later grew around them, of delicate figures waiting for rescue, or of dangerous femme fatales with pistols hidden in skirts, rarely matched the truth. Reality was far less dramatic, yet infinitely more demanding. A woman might be neither a helpless dependent nor a notorious outlaw, but something far harder to define: resilient, practical, and endlessly adaptive. She carried children on her hip while stirring pots. She guided plows when hands were too few. She mourned quietly and worked again the next day because there was no other choice. In towns, women's presence carried another weight. They brought with them not only the balance of households, but also the shaping of culture. Churches often began in parlors led by women's voices. Schools found their roots in their persistence. Even the order of towns, the expectation of civility amid the noise of saloons, often took hold because women demanded it. Their calls for temperance, for safety, for dignity, slowly shaped laws and customs, their influence rippling outward through the dusty streets where men's voices were louder, but not always more lasting. There were women who became legends in their own right, not because they sought fame, but because survival thrust them into it. Ranchers who managed vast spreads alone, businesswomen who carved profit from the raw chaos of new towns, performers who carried music and laughter into saloons that might otherwise have sunk into brawls. Their lives carried shades of independence rarely acknowledged, yet they stood as reminders that the West was not only conquered by men's hands, but built equally upon the unyielding persistence of women. Hardship, however, was never far. Maternal mortality was high, with childbirth shadowed by danger in cabins far from physicians. Illness swept through homes with little resistance, leaving women to nurse others even while fever burned in their own bodies. Exhaustion was constant, and yet pauses were rare. Grief too sat heavily. Infants lost to sickness, husbands lost to gunfire or accidents, children carried into graves marked only by rough-hewn wood. These sorrows were borne quietly, tucked into the folds of daily endurance, rarely recorded but deeply felt. Despite this, women found ways to carve moments of joy. Quilting circles, barn dances, and shared meals broke the monotony of endless labor. Laughter rose in kitchens, songs drifted from porches, and the bond between neighbors offered brief reprieve from solitude. Even in sorrow, women carried rituals that gave shape to grief, gathering to comfort, to cook meals for mourning families, to mark death with dignity in places where the land itself seemed indifferent. Their resilience was a kind of quiet defiance. Against the myth of fragility, they showed endurance. Against the myth of helplessness, they showed skill. Against the silence of history, they left behind the living memory of households kept alive through scarcity, of children raised into adults, of towns seeded with education, faith, and civility. Though their names are often absent from the bold headlines of history, their presence lingers in every corner of what the West became. The role of women in the Wild West was not a tale of myth, but of reality. Unyielding, unromantic, and essential. They were not figures of legend carved into stories of outlaws and lawmen. They were the steady, quiet strength that turned raw land into homes, towns, and futures. Without them, the frontier would have remained only dust and silence. With them, it became a place where families endured, where communities took root, and where the dream of settlement pressed forward despite all odds. When the last strokes of daylight sank behind the horizon, the West did not fall into the kind of night known in towns of the East. Out here, where lamps were few and distances stretched wide, darkness arrived not as a gentle shade, but as an overwhelming presence. The frontier night pressed against doors and windows, vast and consuming, its silence broken only by the cries of coyotes or the creak of timbers settling in the cold. It was in this darkness that the frontier revealed its most fragile side, a world lit only by lanterns and steadied by courage more than certainty. The lantern itself became the quiet guardian of every household, hung from a nail, set upon a table, or carried out into the yard. Its flame turned small spaces of wood and sod into islands of fragile warmth. Families huddled close to its light, its glow illuminating worn faces, rough hands, and the faint outlines of quilts pulled tightly against the chill. Children studied by lantern light, their eyes squinting against shadows that danced across pages. Mothers stitched by it, needles flashing briefly before sinking again into fabric. Fathers read aloud from worn Bibles or newspapers, the words carried softly into rooms that otherwise would have been surrendered to silence. But the lantern's glow was limited. Beyond its reach, darkness remained complete. A man stepping outside to check on animals or fetch water carried with him not just a flame, but a sense of exposure. Every rustle of grass, every crack of a branch could be a predator, a thief, or nothing at all. The frontier taught people not to trust silence, for it could hide danger as easily as peace. The stillness of the plains carried with it the weight of possibility, of storms rolling unseen in the distance, of strangers moving quietly along the edge of town, of wild animals prowling where shadows deepened. For many, fear was not in the noise of night but in its absence. The quiet that stretched across the prairie could feel endless, pressing down until even the beat of one's own heart felt too loud. Inside cabins, the wind outside whistled through cracks, turning silence into a reminder that walls were thin and safety was never certain. A dog's sudden bark, the lowing of cattle, or the faint rattle of a door in the wind could jolt entire households awake, for people knew too well that the dark hours held dangers daylight did not reveal. Travelers on the road knew the night differently. Campsites were marked by small fires, their flames carefully tended and shielded from the wind. Around them, voices dropped to hushed tones, not from secrecy, but from an instinct not to disturb the vastness surrounding them. Sleep was uneasy, taken in shifts, with one or two awake to keep watch while others dozed. Horses shifted and stamped their hooves, ears flicking at sounds too faint for human hearing. To those who journeyed, the silence of the night was not restful but heavy, filled with 1,000 imagined threats waiting just beyond the glow of embers. Even in towns, darkness carried unease. Streets that bustled by day fell quiet, their saloons shuttered or left to the faint echo of piano keys drifting out into the cold. Lanterns burned in a handful of windows, while others stood dark, their residents locked away in the uneasy safety of their homes. Sheriffs or watchmen patrolled the streets with lamps in hand, their boots striking against the wooden planks of sidewalks, their eyes scanning shadows that seemed to shift with every step. A single shout in the night could bring men scrambling with rifles, unsure if the threat was real or imagined. Yet within this ever-present tension, life also carried on. Families found comfort in rituals, the lighting of lamps at dusk, the gathering around fire, the soft voices of prayer or song rising into the still air. The night was not only a space for fear, but also for intimacy, for stories shared in quiet tones, for laughter that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the dark. Couples sat by lanterns and spoke of hopes for the future. Children whispered under quilts, inventing tales to pass the long hours. In these small acts, the night softened, no longer only a reminder of danger, but also of the bonds that made survival possible. The light of lanterns also shaped memory. Faces illuminated by their glow became etched into recollection, their features half-shadowed, their expressions softened by flickering flame. The sound of a wick being trimmed, the faint hiss of oil burning, the dim halo of light cast upon walls. These details wove themselves into the fabric of frontier life, as much as the plow or the rifle. In time, they became symbols of endurance, of how families carved out moments of security against the enormity of the wilderness. Still, the night never fully surrendered. Storms could sweep in without warning, thunder rolling across the plains like drums of war, lightning tearing open the sky to reveal silhouettes of trees and cabins that seemed suddenly fragile. Winds battered homes until shingles rattled, doors shook, and children cried in fear. In those moments, lanterns flickered, flames threatened to vanish, and families clung not to light alone, but to one another. Survival in the dark was never about certainty, but about trust. That the storm would pass, that walls would hold, that morning would eventually come. For some, silence became a teacher rather than an enemy. Farmers learned to read it, listening for shifts in the air that signaled changes in weather. Hunters grew attuned to the stillness before prey approached. Mothers learned to distinguish between the cries of children, unsettled by dreams, and the sharp tones of fear when something stirred outside. Over time, silence became not only something to fear, but something to understand, a language of its own, written in pauses and absences. The nights of the frontier revealed a truth often missed in the brightness of day. Life here was not only about work, about building, or about enduring visible hardships. It was about learning to exist within vastness, to find comfort in the fragile glow of lanterns, to face the unease of silence and to continue despite it. In the quiet, people were reminded of their smallness against the land, yet also of their persistence. Each night endured was another step in shaping a world where morning would bring labor again, where the endless horizons would once more be met with human will. So the lanterns burned, night after night, their glow steady though never strong, a symbol of endurance in a world too large to conquer and too wild to tame. And the silence, though heavy, became part of the rhythm of life, teaching those who lived in the West that survival was not only a matter of work by day, but of courage by night, when fear pressed closest and light was most fragile. When dawn returned after those long, uncertain nights, the light revealed not only towns and farms, but also the endless sweep of plains where cattle moved like shadows upon the horizon. Herds stretched across the land, their hooves churning soil into dust, their lowing voices carrying on the wind. In these broad spaces, another life unfolded, a life tied to the rhythm of trails, to the creak of saddles, and to the figures who rode beside the herds. It was here, upon these shifting paths, that the cowboy came into being, not as legend first, but as laborer, shaping himself against the demands of cattle and land alike. The trail was not a road, but a living thing, marked by dust clouds, by ruts worn deep, by the faint line of grass bent beneath countless hooves. From Texas northward toward railheads in Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond, these routes cut through wilderness and prairie alike, carrying wealth on four legs to markets where demand was rising. The open range made it possible, but it was men in saddles who made it real. Men who slept under stars, rode through storms, and gave their strength to guiding animals that cared little for human plans. The work began with the gathering. Ranches spread across Texas prairies sent riders out at dawn, their voices echoing as they drove scattered cattle into larger groups. Dust rose with every movement, coating faces and clothing until color blurred into the same muted tones of earth. Ropes swung and tightened, branding irons pressed, and herds were prepared for the long march north. These gatherings were noisy, chaotic, and essential. The West's wealth was on the hoof, and before it could reach railroads and cities, it had to be shaped into order by men who lived more on horseback than on the ground. The cowboy's day was measured not by clocks, but by the needs of cattle. At first light, riders moved to the edges of the herd, circling, pressing, and guiding beasts that could scatter at the slightest noise. Meals were taken quickly, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a laughter that cut briefly through the monotony of work. The trail itself was unforgiving. Heat baked the land until the horizon shimmered. Rains turned dust into sucking mud. Rivers swelled and had to be crossed. Cattle driven into water that could sweep them away. Each obstacle tested both animal and rider, demanding endurance beyond comfort. Night on the trail carried its own demands. While the herd lay resting, cowboys took turns riding watch, circling slowly under the stars. They sang low songs to soothe restless animals, voices drifting over the prairie like threads of sound woven into darkness. These songs were practical, calming beasts, whose panic could start a stampede. But they were also intimate, carrying fragments of memory, longing, or faith. A lone rider humming into the night embodied the fragile balance between order and chaos, between man's intent and nature's indifference. The stampede was every cowboy's fear. A clap of thunder, a sudden scent, even the flicker of lightning could send a herd surging in blind terror, thousands of hooves pounding in the dark. In those moments, cowboys leapt to saddle, riding hard at the edges, shouting, whistling, or singing to turn the tide, to curve the flow until panic circled back upon itself. Dust rose, hooves struck sparks, and men risked being trampled beneath the very animals they guarded. Surviving such a night left riders shaken but resolute, for they knew it was part of the life they had chosen. The cowboy's existence was one of contrasts, loneliness bound with camaraderie, hardship tempered by small joys. Around campfires, men shared beans, coffee, and bread, baked in Dutch ovens buried beneath coals. Stories rose with smoke, some true, others shaped into legend, all serving to break the monotony of days. Cards were played, jokes traded, songs sung beneath skies heavy with stars. Yet beneath it all lingered silence, the kind of silence that stretched across the prairie until it pressed against every thought. For many, the trail was less about cattle than about enduring the vastness itself. Horses were partners in this endurance. Each rider knew his mount's temperament as well as his own, trusting in its strength to carry him through storms, across rivers, and into sudden danger. Saddles grew worn, reins frayed, but bonds between horse and man deepened with every mile. A cowboy on foot was incomplete. On horseback, he was defined. The image of man and horse silhouetted against sunset would later become romanticized, but in reality, it was a picture born of necessity, of survival as much as symbolism. The rise of cattle trails reshaped the West. Towns sprang up where railroads met herds, their streets alive with the noise of animals and men. Markets bustled, saloons filled, fortunes changed hands. Yet for the cowboys who drove the herds, these towns were brief interruptions. A few days of rest, of whiskey, of cards or music, and then the return to trail life, where wealth was left behind and the horizon stretched endless once more. Their role was vital yet temporary, shaping economies but leaving few permanent marks of their own. Behind the legend of the cowboy lay exhaustion. Pay was modest, work relentless, and danger constant. Storms, rustlers, disease among cattle, all threatened to undo months of labor. Many who rode the trails were young, some barely more than boys, drawn by the promise of adventure or wages that seemed large compared to farming. Others were men seeking escape, anonymity, or a chance to start again. Among them rode black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, and native men, their contributions often forgotten in stories that later narrowed the cowboy into a singular image. In truth, the trails were as diverse as the land they crossed, shaped by cultures blending in labor and necessity. The end of a drive was both relief and anticlimax. Herds delivered to railheads were handed over, counted, and sold. Cowboys collected wages, sometimes squandered them in days, and prepared for another season. Few grew rich, for the wealth of the West flowed to ranchers and merchants, not to those who rode dusty miles to make it possible. Yet many accepted this with quiet resignation, for the trail had given them something that money could not: the knowledge of endurance, of wide skies, of lives measured in miles and songs. In time, the open range began to close. Barbed wire cut across prairies, railroads spread, and ranching shifted from trail drives to fenced pastures. The cowboy did not vanish but changed. His image carried forward more by memory and myth than by daily reality. Yet the essence of the life remained: the long rides, the bond with horses, the songs under stars, the dust that clung to every part of being. The cattle trails, once noisy with hooves and shouts, fell silent. Grass grew again where dust had risen. Yet the memory of movement lingered, of herds flowing northward like rivers of life, of men who guided them not for glory, but for necessity. In that memory, the cowboy endured, not as hero, but as worker, as wanderer, as figure caught between earth and sky, survival and legend. And so, as the frontier continued to shape itself, the image of the cowboy became inseparable from the West itself. Not in the sense of a story larger than life, but in the quiet recognition that beneath the myths lay men who rode by lantern light, who sang into silence, who traced trails across lands too vast to claim and too unforgiving to forget. The long trails carved by cattle and the weary songs of cowboys under the stars eventually yielded to a new rhythm, one not born of hooves, but of steel. Across the wide plains and mountains, where once only herds and riders passed, the sound of something entirely different began to echo. It was a steady clatter, a low hum building into thunder, the grinding force of wheels on iron rails. The West, which had long measured time by seasons and distances on horseback, now found itself confronted with an iron march that moved faster, straighter, and without rest. The railroad did not simply arrive, it conquered. Men with hammers and spikes pushed its lines forward, cutting across prairies, bridging rivers, tunneling through mountains. Towns rose not at random, but at intervals along the track. their fates tied directly to the line that ran beside them. A place with a depot thrived, a place bypassed withered into silence. The geography of hope was redrawn, not by cattle trails winding with the land, but by rails that cut mercilessly forward, indifferent to valleys or traditions. Construction was itself a saga. Crews of Irish immigrants drove spikes with rhythmic blows, while Chinese laborers scaled cliffs and carved through rock with an endurance few others could match. They worked in blistering sun, in snowstorms, in landscapes that gave no mercy. Avalanches buried some, blasts took others, yet the line advanced. Camps followed the progress, rough and temporary, filled with tents, saloons on wheels, and a restless population that shifted as the tracks grew longer. The railroad was not only steel, it was sweat, blood, and the constant hum of forward motion. When the trains finally ran, they carried with them more than passengers. They brought the East into the West, shrinking distances that had once demanded weeks of travel into days. What had been isolation became connection, and with connection came transformation. Farmers who once relied on scarce local markets could now ship grain, cattle, or produce across the country. Merchants stocked goods that only months earlier had seemed impossibly far. The very rhythm of life shifted, tied now to schedules printed on timetables, to whistles that echoed across the land, signaling departures and arrivals with mechanical certainty. Yet every gain carried a shadow. The freedom of open range faltered when barbed wire fenced-in pastures made valuable by their nearness to rails. The towns that grew were no longer the makeshift wooden clusters of early settlers, but more permanent settlements, shaped by commerce. Prices, wages, and goods were no longer set by the slow balance of local supply and demand, but by markets hundreds of miles away. What had once been a world defined by distance now became vulnerable to the speed of steel. The trains themselves were spectacles. Children ran to watch as they roared past, smoke trailing like a banner in the sky. Horses shied at the noise, dogs barked, and townspeople paused to feel the tremble of ground beneath their feet. To board one was to step into a different kind of space, where cushioned seats and dining cars seemed to erase the hardships of wagon roads. For the wealthy, travel became comfortable, even luxurious. For the poor, it was still faster, still cheaper than weeks on the trail, and it opened doors to places they might otherwise never see. But not all were eager for this change. Native nations, already pressed by settlers and soldiers, now faced a force that carved relentlessly through their hunting grounds. The rails brought not only settlers, but also soldiers, goods, and weapons, ensuring that resistance was met with overwhelming supply and reinforcement. The buffalo herds, once thundering across plains in uncountable numbers, were slaughtered with brutal efficiency, their hides loaded onto freight cars, their absence leaving both ecological silence and cultural devastation. The railroad was not simply progress, it was also loss, carving away ways of life that had endured for centuries. For the cowboy, too, the rails marked an ending. Trails that had once stretched northward for hundreds of miles became shorter, then unnecessary, as herds could be loaded onto trains near the ranches themselves. The great drives diminished, and with them, the long months of life on horseback under open skies. Work remained, but it was transformed. Less freedom, more routine, fewer songs drifting across the night. The cowboy became less a laborer of the present and more a memory, a figure retold in stories even as the steel advanced across his world. Towns along the railroad developed their own peculiar pulse. Depots became gathering points, their platforms crowded with travelers, freight, and locals who came simply to watch the comings and goings. Hotels sprang up near the tracks, saloons expanded, merchants adjusted their prices to the flow of goods. The train became not only transportation, but spectacle, a symbol of connection to the broader world. A package from Boston or New York might arrive in weeks, a newspaper could arrive in days, and news of events from across the ocean seemed suddenly close. Time itself felt compressed, pressing the once expansive silence of the frontier into the narrow rhythm of schedules and clocks. The men who drove the engines were themselves figures of respect and awe. Engineers with gloved hands gripped levers. Firemen shoveled coal into roaring furnaces. Conductors walked the aisles with authority. Their lives were bound to the rails, their movements measured by schedules as rigid as the steel beneath them. To some, they were heroes of progress, masters of the machine. To others, they were simply new laborers in a world that demanded unrelenting work. Yet their presence, like that of the cowboy, shaped the identity of the West. Only this time, not as a figure of the horse and lariat, but as a figure of iron and steam. The railroad's arrival also carried whispers of empire. Where once the West had felt like a distant margin, it was now drawn tightly into the grasp of the nation. Territories hastened towards statehood, governments extended their reach, and law grew firmer where once it had been fragile. The wildness of the frontier was not erased overnight, but it was softened, tamed by the regularity of trains arriving and departing, by the predictability of freight and commerce. The idea of isolation, once central to the identity of the frontier, became harder to sustain when one could travel across the continent in less than a week. And yet, for all its order, the railroad carried its own kind of danger. Accidents were common, boilers exploding, bridges collapsing, wheels derailing on curves. Fires sparked by engines consumed grasslands. Robbers, too, saw opportunity in freight cars heavy with cash or goods, their hold-ups becoming part of the law of the West. The railroad, like the frontier it cut across, carried both promise and peril, progress and risk, each inseparable from the other. In the stillness of the plains, where once the only sounds were wind and herds, the whistle of a locomotive came to dominate. Its cry carried for miles, a lonely, piercing sound that was both mournful and triumphant. For some, it was the voice of opportunity, calling them toward towns and markets that had sprung up in its wake. For others, it was the voice of intrusion, signaling the end of the silence they had once known. But for all, it was inescapable, a sound that marked a turning point in the life of the West. The Iron March did not stop. Rails spread in branching lines, linking mining towns in mountains, connecting farms on plains, stitching the landscape into a network of commerce and control. Telegraph wires followed, binding information as tightly as steel-bound distance. The great, sprawling uncertainty of the frontier became increasingly mapped, measured, and scheduled. The railroad had made the West part of a whole, and in doing so, it had also ended something, an older rhythm, a slower time, a way of life tied more closely to the land and the long endurance of silence. The Wild West remained, but it was less wild than before. Its edges grew sharper, its silences thinner, its distances shorter. The iron rails gleamed in the sun, stretching out toward horizons that no longer seemed infinite, but bounded by schedules and stations. The West was still a place of struggle, of hope, of endurance, but it had changed. It was no longer a place reached only by wagon, trail, or horse. It was a place tied by steel to every other corner of the nation, a place where the march of progress was no longer measured by footsteps or hooves, but by the relentless turning of wheels against iron. And in that steady rhythm, the West took on a new shape. Not a vanishing wilderness, nor an endless frontier, but a land redefined by the hum of engines and the cry of whistles. A land where the old gave way to the new, quietly but inevitably, as the Iron March continued forward, indifferent to those who wished it to stop. With the arrival of iron rails and the steady whistle of locomotives cutting across the horizon, the West found itself bound to new rhythms. The cattle that once thundered along trails, the grain harvested from windswept fields, the timber cut from forests, and the ore pulled from mines, all now had places to go and people to reach. Towns that had once been little more than clusters of wooden shacks grew into centers of exchange, their dusty streets filled with wagons, shop fronts, and the voices of barter. Life, which had been measured in survival and scarcity, began to hum with the noise of markets. Markets in the West were not always grand affairs of stalls and banners. More often, they were practical, shaped by necessity. At the heart of many towns lay a general store, its shelves lined with whatever goods could be brought by wagon or train: sacks of flour, bolts of fabric, iron nails, lantern oil, coffee beans, and jars of penny candy. The general store was more than a shop. It was the pulse of a community. Farmers brought in produce to trade, cowboys purchased gear, families browsed with lists scribbled in careful hands. To step inside was to step into the shared rhythm of survival, where neighbors met. Gossip mingled with commerce, and the flow of goods tied the town together. Behind the counters stood merchants, figures as familiar as sheriffs or preachers. They were keepers of stock, but also keepers of memory, knowing who was in debt, who had prospered, who needed credit until the next harvest. Many extended goods on trust, keeping ledgers with rows of names, marks, and balances. In a place where cash was often scarce, these books carried the weight of relationships. To fail a payment was more than a financial lapse. It was a strain on reputation, a fracture in the fragile web of trust that bound communities. Beyond the general store, towns grew to host butchers, blacksmiths, and bakers, each shaping the rhythm of daily life. The blacksmith's hammer rang through the streets, sharpening plough blades, repairing wagon wheels, shoeing horses that were still vital despite the growing reach of railroads. Bakers filled the morning air with the scent of bread, their loaves carried home in cloth sacks by children. Butchers carved meat brought in from nearby ranches, their counters stained from long hours of labor. Trade here was not exotic but essential, a constant negotiation with necessity. Saturday often brought the largest gatherings, when farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk converged. Wagons lined the edges of markets, laden with eggs, butter, hides, or vegetables. Barter was common, one man trading surplus corn for a length of rope, another swapping fresh milk for a small sack of nails. Coins passed hands too, though they were often scarce. Each trade, whether small or large, stitched lives together in ways that went beyond economics. It was through these exchanges that people felt the presence of community, that sense of being tied into a collective effort of survival. Traveling peddlers added color to this world. With wagons rattling under the weight of goods, they brought wares not often seen in isolated places. Combs from the East, tin toys, glass beads, or patent medicines promising cure-alls in bold labels. Their arrival was an event, children pressing close to see the novelty, adults measuring wants against scarce coins. Some peddlers charmed, others deceived, but all added to the flow of goods that made frontier life feel less remote, less cut off from distant cities. Markets were also places where cultures met. In some towns, Mexican vaqueros traded saddles and silverwork beside Anglo settlers. Native artisans sometimes brought beadwork, baskets, or hides, though often under the weight of dwindling autonomy. Black merchants carved niches too, offering skilled labor or specialized trade, reminding all who passed that the West was not a single culture, but a weave of many threads. These moments of exchange, though often tense or uneven, revealed the layered character of the frontier, a place of blending as much as of division. The influence of the railroad reshaped trade with startling speed. Goods that once took months to arrive now came in regular shipments. Tea, sugar, coffee, and spices became staples where once they had been luxuries. Dry goods stores stocked dresses in the latest fashions, their fabrics shipped in from distant mills. Tools arrived more cheaply, mail-order catalogs spread, and the very idea of consumer choice began to take root. For the first time, families could order items from across the country, waiting with a sense of anticipation for parcels delivered by train. And yet, despite this growing connection, the realities of trade remained hard. Prices rose and fell with markets far beyond the control of small-town merchants. A poor wheat harvest in one state could ripple into shortages elsewhere. Railroads themselves controlled much of the economy, charging fees that sometimes crushed farmers, who had little choice but to ship their crops along a single line. Merchants adapted as best they could, balancing the expectations of neighbors with the demands of distant corporations. Markets were not only about goods, they were also about news. In the clatter of wagons and the shuffle of feet, stories passed. A letter delivered to one merchant was read aloud by lamplight, shared with neighbors who had none. Newspapers spread quickly from hand to hand, their pages folded and refolded until ink blurred. Merchants became informal hubs of information, their counters doubling as places to hear of wars abroad, political changes, or events in neighboring states. In this way, commerce and communication intertwined, shrinking the sense of distance across the plains. Children experienced markets with a kind of wonder. A penny meant a piece of candy, brightly wrapped, or perhaps a simple toy carved from wood. Women lingered over fabrics, imagining new dresses or curtains. Men inspected tools, weighing quality against cost. Each had their rituals, their places of interest, but together they formed a choreography that repeated week after week, season after season. At harvest time, trade swelled. Wagons rolled into town heavy with grain or hay, farmers selling bulk to merchants who stored it in granaries or shipped it onward by train. Ranchers sold hides, tallow, or cattle. Their profits poured back into equipment for the next year. The rhythm of the land dictated the rhythm of trade, tying every purchase and every sale to the unpredictable generosity of weather and soil. The saloons, never far from markets, absorbed part of this energy. Coins earned in trade sometimes passed quickly across bars, exchanged for whiskey or beer. Merchants themselves often gathered there after closing their shops, the day's work giving way to talk, cards, or silence. Commerce did not end at the store's door. It flowed into every corner of the town, shaping even the spaces of leisure. In winter, when roads froze and wagons slowed, trade grew quieter but did not cease. Merchants relied more heavily on shipments by train, their shelves stocked with canned goods, dried fruits, or salted meats that could endure the cold months. Families stretched their supplies carefully, but the general store remained open, its lantern casting light against snow-covered streets. Even in silence, the pulse of commerce continued, for survival itself depended on it. Over time, trade brought permanence. Wooden storefronts gave way to brick, glass windows widened, and sidewalks were built. Merchants who had once lived behind counters in cramped quarters built larger homes. Their prosperity tied not to luck, but to the steady flow of goods. Markets grew more organized, fairs were held, and even banks emerged, offering credit, savings, and loans to those who had once relied only on trust. And yet, for all its growth, trade in the West never lost its sense of fragility. A poor harvest, a drought, a downturn in national markets could strip shelves bare or leave debts unpaid. Merchants balanced constantly between optimism and worry, aware that prosperity was as temporary as weather. Still, the rhythm endured. Goods arrived, were sold, were consumed, and new goods arrived again. The marketplace, in all its simplicity, revealed the deeper truth of the West, that survival was not only about strength or courage, but about exchange, about the constant weaving together of labor, goods, and trust. A sack of flour, a bolt of cloth, a length of rope. Each object carried with it the story of countless hands, from those who produced it far away to those who sold it in small towns, to those who used it in kitchens, fields, and homes. Thus, the Wild West, often imagined as a place of rugged independence, was in reality a place of constant interdependence. Markets were its quiet proof, reminding all who walked their dusty lanes that no one endured alone, that even the strongest homestead was bound by the goods it could trade, the credit it could secure, the community it leaned upon. And so, amid the clatter of wagons and the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, amid the chatter of merchants tallying accounts and children pressing coins to counters, the life of the West found its everyday rhythm, not in grand battles or legends, but in the ordinary pulse of trade, a rhythm steady enough, persistent enough, to turn a frontier of dust and distance into towns of permanence, each one stitched into the fabric of the nation by the flow of markets and the hands of those who kept them alive. The bustle of markets, with their shelves of flour, fabric, and tools, gave shape to the daily rhythms of Western towns. But survival was never measured only in trade. Beneath the surface of commerce and chatter lay the quiet, ever-present shadow of illness and injury. Life on the frontier tested the body relentlessly. Dust storms that filled lungs, accidents in fields or mines, fevers that swept through homes without warning. In such a place, medicine was not a luxury. It was a fragile hope, often improvised, sometimes misguided, and always precarious. Doctors in the West arrived in many forms. Some were formally trained, having studied in medical schools back east or even in Europe, their knowledge carried in heavy books and leather satchels. Others, however, were less learned, calling themselves doctors with little more than experience or boldness to their name. Towns often welcomed whoever came, because choice was scarce. A man with steady hands, whether or not he held a degree, was often the one called when a bone snapped, when childbirth faltered, or when a fever burned too long. Medical practice in these towns was rarely anchored in grand hospitals. Instead, it unfolded in parlors, in barns, in cabins lit by oil lamps. A doctor might arrive on horseback carrying instruments wrapped in cloth, a small bag of bottles clinking at his side. Treatments were administered wherever space allowed. A kitchen table turned into an operating surface, a bed pulled close to the light of a window. Sterility, as we understand it now, was not yet widely practiced. Instruments were wiped clean, perhaps with whiskey or boiled water if available, but infections were a constant risk. Remedies filled the gaps where doctors could not always reach. Families kept their own collections of treatments, handed down by word of mouth, written in worn journals, or learned from neighbors. Herbal teas brewed from local plants soothed coughs. Mustard plasters were pressed to chests to draw out sickness. Whiskey doubled as both painkiller and antiseptic. For fevers, cool cloths and patience were often the only options. These remedies carried no guarantees, but in a land where distance and scarcity defined life, they offered some semblance of control. Patent medicines, sold by traveling peddlers or stocked in general stores, added another layer to the story. Brightly labeled bottles promised cures for every ailment: tonic for the blood, elixirs for nerves, syrups for coughs. Many were laced with alcohol, opium, or other potent ingredients, their effects as numbing as they were healing. Advertisements in newspapers painted them as miracles, and many households kept at least one such bottle on a shelf, turning to it when sickness seemed too heavy to bear. The line between medicine and harm was thin and often crossed unknowingly. Childbirth, one of the most frequent and perilous events, revealed the stark realities of frontier medicine. Midwives were common, often women with practical knowledge passed through generations. They delivered children in small cabins, using whatever tools were available. Complications were frequent, and mothers sometimes did not survive. The cries of newborns mingled with the quiet grief of families who knew how fragile life remained, even as communities grew. For many, the joy of new beginnings was tempered by the risk that each birth carried. Injuries were another constant. A fall from a horse, a wagon accident, or a careless strike with an axe could leave a man incapacitated in moments. Without advanced surgeries or antibiotics, survival often depended on the body's resilience and the care of those nearby. Bones were set with splints fashioned from wood. Deep wounds were stitched with coarse thread. Amputations, though feared, were sometimes the only option to prevent the spread of infection. A doctor's steady hand, a bottle of whiskey to dull the pain, and the prayers of loved ones often determined the outcome. Diseases moved through towns with a swiftness that markets and trade unwittingly encouraged. Goods carried on trains and wagons also carried germs. Influenza, cholera, smallpox and diphtheria swept through communities, leaving behind rows of fresh graves. Quarantine was one of the few defenses, households marking their doors, or neighbors avoiding entire streets when sickness spread. Yet despite the fear, neighbors often cared for one another. delivering food to afflicted families or sitting at bedsides when strength was needed most. Graveyards, often perched on hillsides just beyond town, grew steadily. Simple wooden markers leaned with the wind, names carved into them by hand. Death was not always sudden, but it was never far. The presence of cemeteries at the edges of towns was a constant reminder of how thin the line was between survival and loss. Doctors did their best. Remedies offered what comfort they could. But the West remained a place where endurance was measured against forces far greater than human knowledge. Still, resilience grew in unexpected ways. Families taught children small remedies, teaching them to brew teas or apply poultices. Women became adept at managing fevers, tending wounds, and caring for the sick, their knowledge forming a quiet, practical backbone of survival. Community support networks developed, with neighbors stepping in to help when illness struck a household. Even when medicine faltered, compassion often filled the gap. There were moments, too, of progress. As railroads expanded, so did access to medical supplies. Bandages, syringes, and manufactured drugs arrived more reliably. Some towns eventually built small hospitals, often no more than a handful of beds in a converted building, but enough to centralize care. Medical journals and books circulated, bringing new knowledge even to distant places. The practices of cleanliness, sterilization, and vaccination spread slowly, but they began to change outcomes, giving people tools to fight back against sickness. Traveling doctors sometimes moved from town to town, offering services where no permanent physician lived. Their arrival was both practical and symbolic, an acknowledgement that even in places where life seemed harsh and forgotten, the effort to heal was never abandoned. These figures, often weary from long rides, became lifelines for scattered families, their presence remembered with gratitude long after they had moved on. For all the hardship, there was also a quiet acceptance. The people of the West lived close to the land, and with that came an understanding that life was fragile, fleeting. Death was not hidden away, but acknowledged as part of existence. Communities grieved together, supported one another, and continued forward. Medicine may not have always been sufficient, but the will to endure was. The story of doctors, remedies, and harsh realities in the Wild West is not one of miracles, but of endurance. It is the story of families who made do with what they had, of communities who stood together when sickness struck, of doctors who carried knowledge across dusty miles, and of remedies, both practical and questionable, that offered hope in uncertain times. Each bottle, each poultice, each stitched wound reflected the determination to push forward, to carve life out of a land that tested body and spirit alike. In the quiet rhythm of these efforts, the West revealed another side of itself, not only as a place of cowboys, railroads, or markets, but as a place where every breath, every recovery, and every loss was part of the unbroken struggle to live in a world that offered no guarantees. And it was in this struggle, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the real texture of life could be felt, raw, uncertain, but profoundly human. The quiet struggles of illness and hardship on the frontier gave way from time to something brighter, moments when townspeople gathered not to mourn or endure, but to celebrate, to breathe, to remind themselves that life was more than toil and uncertainty. For all the hunger, dust, and danger of the Wild West, there was always the undercurrent of joy, a yearning to lift voices in song, to laugh, to dance, to share stories under the glow of lanterns strung between posts. Festivals in these towns were rarely extravagant, yet they carried a weight of meaning that far exceeded their simple forms. A harvest gathering, for example, might be nothing more than a shared meal in a barn. Tables lined with pies and stews prepared from the season's labor. Neighbors who had not seen one another for weeks or months would arrive on wagons, bringing baskets of food and news from their homesteads. Music would rise from fiddles or banjos, and children would run between the legs of their elders, squealing with delight at the sense of freedom. Holidays, too, were observed with a unique frontier flavor. Christmas might bring small gifts, hand-carved toys, knitted scarves, jars of preserved fruit, offered with the kind of gratitude that only scarcity could teach. Independence Day, marked with parades or speeches, reminded settlers of the larger nation they had left behind, a tether to an identity that stretched far beyond the prairie or desert. Even simple occasions, like the dedication of a new church or school, turned into community-wide celebrations, drawing together the scattered threads of daily life into a single, vibrant tapestry. Music was at the heart of many of these gatherings. Without radios or recorded sound, songs lived only in the breath and fingers of those who played them. A fiddle could transform a dim saloon into a lively dance hall, its bow pulling life from thin strings until boots stomped the wooden floors in rhythm. Cowboys on cattle trails carried harmonicas, their lonely notes rising against the wide skies at night. Families sang hymns together on Sundays, the voices of parents and children weaving through the rafters of small churches. In every form, music softened the edges of hardship and gave shape to shared experience. Songs themselves carried stories, fragments of memory and longing, ballads told of lost loves, of distant homelands, of journeys undertaken with little more than hope. Some were humorous, poking fun at daily struggles, turning misfortune into laughter. Others were somber, reflections of sorrow that needed release. In singing, communities found not just entertainment, but connection, a way of saying, without words, that no one was alone in the vastness of the frontier. Dance followed naturally from music. Barn dances were common, especially in agricultural regions. A cleared space, a fiddler, and the eager energy of neighbors were all that was needed. Square dances, reels, and waltzes unfolded with a mix of formality and improvisation. The steps themselves mattered less than the movement, the laughter, the spinning of partners beneath lantern light. For many young people, these dances offered one of the few opportunities to meet others, to court, to imagine futures beyond the daily grind of survival. Storytelling, too, had its place in these gatherings. Around campfires or in crowded rooms, men and women shared tales, some true, others embroidered with exaggeration until they became legend. Outlaws, cattle drives, encounters with wild animals, all became material for narrative. These stories entertained, but they also served to bind communities, giving shape to collective memory. Even in their exaggerations, they reflected something real, the human need to make sense of life, to turn chaos into story, to give laughter or awe to experiences that might otherwise be only hardship. The need for joy extended beyond organized festivals. Simple moments of leisure punctuated daily life. A game of cards in a saloon, a contest of marksmanship outside town, or children playing tag in dusty streets. All were small acts of resistance against the weight of survival. These moments were not grand, but they mattered deeply, reminding people that life was not only about enduring, but about living. Religion, often thought of as somber, also carried elements of joy. Church services, particularly in small frontier towns, often blended worship with fellowship. Singing hymns was both spiritual and communal, a release of emotion and a way of affirming bonds. After services, picnics or shared meals turned Sundays into full days of gathering, blurring the line between solemn devotion and simple human connection. Traveling performers occasionally brought new excitement. Minstrel shows, theatrical troupes, or even circus caravans would stop in towns, filling saloons or makeshift stages with performances. For communities accustomed to routine, such visits were extraordinary events. Posters were nailed to posts in advance, children buzzed with anticipation, and when the day arrived, crowds gathered in numbers that transformed the quiet streets into rivers of voices. Laughter and applause echoed long after the wagons rolled away. Even work itself sometimes became a festival. A barn raising, for example, was both labor and celebration. Neighbors came together to help build, the heavy timbers lifted with many hands, the day filled with the sweat of effort. But once the work was done, food was shared, fiddles played, and the labor turned into festivity. In this way, necessity and joy intertwined, proving that community could transform even toil into something worth celebrating. Food, simple though it often was, became central to these occasions. Freshly baked bread, stews simmered with whatever meat and vegetables were available, pies made from apples or berries. These meals carried more than flavor. They carried the labor of the land, the generosity of neighbors, the sense of abundance in a world that often knew scarcity. Eating together was a ritual of belonging, a reminder that survival was not endured alone. The importance of joy in the Wild West cannot be overstated. Without these festivals, songs, and moments of laughter, the hardships of frontier life might have overwhelmed communities entirely. The celebrations were not escapism so much as necessity, a way of balancing the scales, of giving people a reason to endure the endless dust, the uncertainty, the harsh realities of daily existence. In the dim glow of lanterns swinging gently from rafters, in the sound of boots striking wooden floors, in the rise of voices carrying a song across a quiet plain, there was something profoundly human. The West, with all its dangers and demands, was also a place of life, of resilience expressed not only in endurance, but in joy. Each note of music, each festival meal, each story told by firelight became part of a rhythm that allowed people not only to survive, but to remember why survival mattered. And so, in the long arc of Western history, it is not only the lawmen, outlaws, railroads, or cattle trails that deserve remembrance. It is also the nights of laughter, the fiddles playing until dawn, the shared loaves of bread, the children running free while lanterns swayed overhead. For in those moments, fleeting yet powerful, the people of the frontier reclaimed their humanity, asserting that even in a world of dust and hardship, joy had its rightful place. For all the moments of laughter, music, and gatherings that brightened the towns of the West, the land itself remained an unyielding companion, reminding everyone that joy was always fleeting, always balanced against the trials of nature. Life on the frontier was lived in rhythm with the seasons, and each season brought its own brand of hardship. In the long stretch of winter, hunger crept into homes as steadily as the cold, while summers carried with them dust storms, searing heat, and fields cracked with thirst. Winter settled not as a sudden event, but as a slow, tightening grip. The days shortened, the winds sharpened, and the snow arrived in waves that seemed to bury the world in silence. Wagons no longer rolled freely across frozen ground, and roads between towns became treacherous or impassable. Families withdrew into their homes, huddled near stoves or fireplaces, conserving wood with careful calculation. Each log burned was weighed against how many more weeks of frost might lie ahead. Food stores were measured with equal care. Root cellars, stocked during the harvest months, became the center of survival. Potatoes, onions, salted pork, jars of pickled vegetables, all were counted, rationed, and stretched as far as possible. The monotony of winter meals was endured with quiet discipline, because there was no room for extravagance. Fresh produce disappeared until spring returned, and meat became scarce unless hunting was successful. Even then, the cold often drove game animals deep into the woods, leaving traps and rifles waiting in vain. Hunger was not always dramatic but persistent, a slow thinning of strength, a constant awareness that each meal was a calculation. Families grew pale, children restless. A stew might be stretched for days, its broth thinned until it was little more than flavored water. Yet the shared bowls carried more than nourishment. They carried the hope of seeing spring again. Isolation deepened the difficulty. Snowstorms could last for days, cutting off even the nearest neighbors. Windows frosted over, doors froze shut, and the silence outside grew thick. Lantern light flickered against walls as families told stories, played simple games, or mended clothing, anything to pass the hours while the wind howled. For many, these long nights left imprints of memory as vivid as any gunfight or cattle drive. Survival was not a matter of heroism, but of patience, discipline, and endurance. If winters tested endurance, summers demanded resilience in other ways. As the snows melted, the land revived, but the promise of warmth carried its own trials. Heat pressed down on fields, drying soil until it cracked in jagged patterns. Dust rose with every step, filling lungs, coating clothes, and turning the air into a constant haze. Farmers planted crops with hope, but rain was uncertain, and when the skies withheld it, despair spread as surely as drought. Dust storms swept across the plains without warning. Clouds of soil blotted out the sun, rolling like waves across open land. Wagons disappeared in the brown haze, and families sealed their windows with cloth, trying in vain to keep the grit from entering their homes. The storms did not discriminate. Fields, towns, and livestock were swallowed in their path. Afterward, children coughed for days. Food supplies dwindled further, and the dream of harvest seemed cruelly out of reach. The summers also brought insects in swarms, grasshoppers that descended upon crops, leaving fields stripped bare within hours. Farmers watched helplessly as weeks of labor vanished in the sound of clicking wings. Such losses were devastating, because in the cycle of the West, one failed season could mean an empty winter ahead. Yet even in the face of hunger and dust, people found ways to adapt. Families preserved every scrap of food they could, drying meat, canning vegetables, making bread from coarse flours. Women gathered wild berries or herbs to add variety to meals. Children learned early the importance of wasting nothing, of treating every crust of bread as a treasure. The scarcity shaped habits that endured for lifetimes, long after the frontier faded. The livestock that sustained families also bore the weight of the seasons. In winter, cattle and horses required feed that was often as scarce as food for humans. In summer, the animals endured dust and heat, sometimes collapsing under the strain. Entire herds could be lost to harsh winters or parched summers, leaving families without the means to plough fields or transport goods. Each animal was more than property. It was a partner in survival, and its loss was felt as deeply as any other. Communities, too, bore the scars of these cycles. A bad winter or summer could empty a town as families packed what little they had and sought better prospects elsewhere. Abandoned cabins and barns dotted the landscapes, reminders of those who could not endure. But those who stayed drew closer together. Neighbors shared food when possible, or took in children when parents fell ill. In the harshest times, survival was rarely a solitary achievement. It was a communal act of resilience. Children experienced these extremes in ways that shaped their earliest memories. Winters meant long days indoors, learning to read by firelight, carving toys from scraps of wood, or listening to tales told by elders. Summers meant chores in the heat, carrying water, chasing animals from gardens, or helping to protect crops from pests. Their play was woven into work, their laughter set against the backdrop of necessity. And in this way, the rhythms of the seasons shaped not only survival, but the very fabric of childhood in the West. Despite the hardship, the cycles of hunger and dust carried with them a strange kind of wisdom. They reminded people of the fragility of life, of the necessity of preparation, of the value of each harvest and each animal raised. In a land where nature held ultimate power, humility was not a choice, but a way of life. There were moments, too, when the beauty of the land revealed itself even in its severity. Winter mornings, when the world lay under a silent blanket of snow, carried a stillness that seemed almost sacred. Summer evenings, when the sky turned orange and dust settled into quiet, revealed horizons that stretched endlessly, promising something beyond the hardship. These glimpses of beauty gave meaning to the struggle, reminding people why they endured. The seasons became, in time, a teacher as much as an adversary. They taught patience, resilience, and the importance of community. They taught that joy must be grasped when it appeared, that songs and festivals were not luxuries, but lifelines. And they taught that survival was not only about enduring hunger or dust, but about finding purpose in the act of enduring itself. In the long story of the Wild West, The battles fought against winter's hunger and summer's dust are often overlooked in favor of tales of gunfights, cattle drives, and outlaws. Yet these quieter struggles shaped life just as deeply, forming the rhythm that all else depended upon. For beneath the noise of history lies the steady truth. The frontier was never conquered by force of arms alone, but by the quiet endurance of those who faced the seasons and refused to yield. And so, when one thinks of the Wild West, it is worth remembering not only the saloons and railroads, but the families measuring their food by lantern light, the farmers watching the horizon for rain, the children coughing in dust storms, and the neighbors sharing what little they had. For in those winters of hunger and summers of dust, the true heart of survival beat steadily, fragile yet unbroken. The West had always been painted in bold colors of promise, the open land, the rivers waiting to be bridged, the soil believed to be boundless in fertility. These visions lured thousands to pack wagons, to uproot families, and to gamble their futures on a horizon they had never seen. But dreams are fragile things, and the longer the years wore on, the more the sharp edges of reality chipped away at the picture so many had carried with them across mountains and plains. The frontier was never static. Every passing year saw more fences erected, more rails hammered into the earth, more towns sprouting where once there had only been camps. With each fence, the idea of boundless freedom narrowed, parceled into neat lines and property claims. The myth of endless land was revealed for what it was: finite, claimed, fought over, and often disappointing in its yield. For many, the dream faltered first in the soil itself. What had been promised as rich and fertile turned stubborn and uncooperative. Seasons of drought, waves of insects, and the endless grind of manual labor left fields ragged and unproductive. Families who had once spoken in hopeful tones about the bounty they would reap now whispered anxiously about debts, mortgages, and the very real possibility of losing the land they had sacrificed everything to obtain. The dream of prosperity withered into survival, and survival itself grew precarious. Railroads, hailed as engines of progress, also carried disillusionment with them. They connected distant markets, yes, but they also brought competition, corporate power, and the relentless pressure of schedules and costs. Small farmers found themselves at the mercy of rail companies, forced to pay steep prices to transport their modest crops, while larger enterprises expanded their reach and tightened their hold. The iron lines that cut across the prairies did more than link towns. They also tied individuals to a system that often worked against them. Towns that had once sprung to life with feverish energy often faded just as quickly. Mining booms ended as suddenly as they began, leaving behind hollow buildings and abandoned saloons. Streets that had been noisy with wagons and laughter grew silent, the dust reclaiming what ambition had briefly carved out. Dreams of striking it rich in gold or silver became, for most, the reality of empty pockets and weary footsteps toward yet another uncertain horizon. Even those who had prospered began to sense the shifting of the age. Wealth was no guarantee of permanence in a land where fortunes were so often built on fragile foundations. One poor harvest, one failed shipment, one collapsed mine, and years of labor could vanish. The West had never promised fairness, and the dream, once radiant, revealed itself to be riddled with chance. For the people who lived through it, the fading dream was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. It came in moments too small to notice at first. A cracked plow blade that could not be replaced until spring. A neighbor leaving quietly in the night to try again elsewhere. A child asking why their dinner bowl seemed smaller than it had last year. It came in the weary posture of men at the saloon who spoke less of opportunities and more of debts. It came in the quiet determination of women who patched the same coat year after year, unwilling to admit that no new one would be bought. The myth of freedom, too, wore thin. The open prairies, once imagined as untouched, had always been home to others. Indigenous peoples whose lives and cultures were systematically pushed aside to make way for settlement. The dream of the frontier was, in truth, a dream for some and a dispossession for others. As the years passed, the violence and displacement grew harder to ignore. For settlers, it created an unease that lingered beneath the daily work of survival. For native peoples, it was the dismantling of a world they had always known. Technology, once celebrated as a partner to progress, carried its own shadows. Barbed wire, for example, transformed the land. It allowed ranchers and farmers to mark their boundaries, to protect crops and cattle. But it also fractured the openness that had defined the landscape. Trails once free to all became cut off. Cattle drives, once legendary, dwindled as open ranges disappeared. Cowboys found their work shrinking, their freedom reduced to hired labor on someone else's enclosed land. What had seemed like a wide canvas of possibility shrank into divided parcels of control. Even the sense of adventure that had drawn so many began to dim. The hardships, the dust, the hunger, the loneliness. These had always been part of life in the West, but when weighed against fading prospects, they became heavier. Letters sent back east no longer spoke only of hope and opportunity. They carried words of caution, even despair. Families who had once been the envy of their neighbors for setting out into the frontier became examples of cautionary tales. Proof that the dream was not for everyone, perhaps not for most. The passing of time deepened the disillusionment. Children born on the frontier grew into adulthood having known nothing but its struggles. For them, the dream was not something carried from far-off lands, but something lived and measured against hunger, against dust storms, against debts unpaid. They saw less of the glory and more of the grind. And when they dreamed, it was often of leaving rather than staying. And yet, there was never a single moment when the dream vanished entirely. It lingered in fragments, in the glint of a river at sunrise, in the rare bounty of a successful harvest, in the resilience of neighbors who shared what little they had. The fading of the dream did not erase hope altogether. It only made it quieter, smaller, and harder to sustain. Some adapted by reshaping the dream itself. If prosperity was out of reach, then survival became its own form of success. If independence was no longer possible, then community became the anchor. Churches grew, schools were built, and even as the myth of the boundless frontier dissolved, people found ways to give meaning to their days. The dream was no longer about conquering land or striking it rich. It became about enduring, about leaving something, however modest, for the next generation. There were always those who refused to let go of the old image entirely. Storytellers, dime novelists, and traveling performers carried the myth forward, spinning tales of cowboys, outlaws, and gold strikes that rarely matched the truth. These stories comforted those who had left the West behind or who never saw it at all. But for those still living in its reality, the gap between legend and life grew wider with each passing year. The fading of the frontier dream was, in many ways, the fading of innocence. The land had been imagined as a blank page, waiting for bold new stories to be written. Instead, it revealed itself as a place of limits, hardships, and compromises. The dream did not disappear in a dramatic collapse, but wore away like a trail under countless footsteps until what remained was something quieter, less dazzling, yet still enduring. In the end, the dream became less about endless opportunity and more about acceptance. Acceptance that the land was harsh and often unyielding. Acceptance that wealth and success were fragile, fleeting things. Acceptance that survival itself was an achievement worth honoring. And though the stories told in later years often returned to the brighter myths, those who had lived the frontier knew the truth. The West was not a land of boundless freedom or unending riches, but a place where dreams faded into dust, where people endured not because of the promise, but in spite of it. And so, as the night draws quieter, we step back from the long roads, the wagons, the small towns, and the voices of a world that once stretched across the plains. What we have walked through together was not the noisy West of movies and myths, but the quieter one, the one of dust on the tongue, of lanterns flickering against canvas, of families holding their breath against silence and distance. We have seen how every mile of road was a test, how survival meant hard choices, and how even in the face of hunger, storms, and loneliness, people still built homes, still carved out lives, still made space for songs, laughter, and hope. The West was never only about gunfights or riches. It was about endurance. It was about ordinary people holding on, step by step, until the horizon slowly gave way to something new. When you think back on tonight's journey, what stayed with you most? Was it the endless dust that clung to skin and throat? The lantern light pushing against the darkness? Or perhaps the way the land itself seemed both cruel and beautiful, swallowing wagons, but also giving back quiet moments of peace? Let me know in the comments what part of this story drifted deepest into your thoughts. And before you close your eyes for the night, take a moment to subscribe. It's the easiest way to keep these quiet histories alive, letting them reach others who, like you, might be listening in the dark, searching for stillness. Your support is what keeps this journey moving forward, one story at a time. Sleep well, and until the next time, may your own road, long or short, carry you gently to rest.